Hey skeptics, a quick safety announcement before we begin today's podcast. Bushfires continue to be a real and imminent threat in Victoria. For up-to-date information about current fire conditions, please check the Vic Emergency website on www.emergency.vic.gov.au. That's www.emergency.vic.gov.au. Or tune into ABC Radio AM frequency. Bushfire plans can be downloaded free of charge from the Country Fire Authority's website, www.cfa.vic.gov.au, www.cfa.vic.gov.au, and the best plan if you live in a bushfire-prone area is always to leave early. In an emergency, dial 000. Now, let's get on with the podcast. It's the 6th of February 1851, and the worst bushfire in Victorian history is sweeping through the colony. The terrified colonists can do nothing but flee as the fire marches towards Melbourne, burning everything in its path. The sky is filled with choking smoke, and the sun is glowing an eerie, vivid red, a sight which local author Rolf Boulderwood likens to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79. Others fear the end of days is upon them, and panic grips the population. Thankfully, the fire changes direction before it reaches Melbourne, a wood and canvas city which would have gone up like London in 1666, and by some miracle, the death toll numbers only 12 once the fire has burned out. This is even more incredible when it is revealed that 5 million hectares, roughly 50,000 square kilometres, of the colony has been burned. The devastation is unlike anything the European colonists have experienced, and some of the squatters abandon their burned out holdings, now filled with rotting carcasses of their roasted flocks and herds, and return, bankrupt and bitter, to Britain. For those who don't want to leave, or can't, they must learn to cope with this new and terrifying phenomenon, the bushfire. But what made Black Thursday, as it came to be known, so devastating? There has never been another fire of that magnitude in Victoria to this day. We've had deadlier fires, but they've all been smaller. And how did it start? Was the death toll accurate? How did it affect survivors? And what did it have to do with the gold rush that erupted just months later? I'm Juliana, and you're listening to The Skeptical Historian. Hello, my fellow skeptics, and thank you so much, as always, for joining me. Before we jump into the podcast, I would like to acknowledge that I am recording today on the sovereign and unceded lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Shout out also to Studio 4 at the State Library of Victoria, where this episode is being recorded. For more information, or if you would like to book the studio yourself, please head to www.slv.vic.gov.au, www.statelibraryvictoria.vic.gov.au. And even though I'm going to be talking mostly about the Black Thursday bushfires of 1851, I do want to make a few safety announcements, as bushfires remain a real and imminent threat for many Victorians today, and it's the beginning of February, so we're still very much in bushfire season. And of course, fires are a thing all over the world. At the time of recording, there are massive wildfires ongoing in Los Angeles, California, and in my state, Victoria, in Australia, we've also seen some large fires around the Grampians areas, but despite the dangers they pose, there are many simple precautions you can take to reduce the risks to yourselves and your loved ones during a bushfire. Now, these are Australia or more Victoria-specific tips. Please check your local emergency services for specific local information. But things such as having a well-practiced bushfire plan, clearing vegetation from around your property, keeping your gutters clear, and knowing both when to leave and what the safest evacuation routes are will help keep you safe in a crisis. Leaving early, of course, is always the safest option, and the CFA, the Country Fire Authority, defines leaving early as leaving an area before a fire starts, not when you can see flames or smell smoke. If you can't leave, you can take shelter at a neighbourhood safer place or bushfire place of last resort, but as these names suggest, these are last resorts. Your bushfire plan should not rely on accessing these places. They are not emergency hubs. They are simply areas that are going to be the safest place to go if you become trapped in a bushfire area. But they're not safe. They just offer some improved protection. They don't provide support services such as food, drink, or medical care. Emergency services won't be present there. They're usually exposed to the elements. They don't have provision for pets or livestock, and you may have to actively defend it from the fire. They are only to be used when there is nowhere else to go and you cannot leave if you've become trapped. They are places like ovals or sporting grounds. So really, they're not actually places you want to be. So I say it again, the safest place to be during a bushfire is out of the bushfire area. You can find a list of neighbourhood safer places on the CFA website, but please, please, please always plan to leave early. This is not a fail-safe strategy. Of course, fire is incredibly unpredictable and conditions can change or deteriorate very rapidly, and you may need to use a neighbourhood safer place. Knowing where they are is important, but don't rely on them. You can find further information about bushfire safety on the CFA website, and make sure to check your local fire danger ratings daily during bushfire season and be aware of what you can and can't do on total fire ban days. Call 000 in any emergency and leave early. I will never, ever, ever get tired of saying that. Get out. Don't stay. Your house is not worth your life. Unfortunately, in 1851, there was no 000, no Country Fire Authority or Fire Rescue Victoria, no bushfire plans, no places of last resort, and no understanding among the European colonial population of what a bushfire was, or any notions of bushfire safety. At this time in Victoria, most of the white population had come from Britain, mostly England or Ireland, and this was before the gold rush, so this population was relatively small. On the 31st of December 1850, just 2 months before Black Thursday, total population in Victoria was recorded as 69,739 people. This figure was not entirely accurate, something I will discuss later, but I'll use it as a baseline in this podcast. Today, the population of Melbourne alone is just over 5 million people. But 1851 was very early days for European settlement in Victoria. The then Port Phillip district of New South Wales, which later became Victoria, had received news in November 1850 that it would separate in New South Wales and become its own colony, but Europeans had been settling there since Batman and Faulkner arrived in 1853. Have a listen to the Season 2 episode, The Tale of Two Johns, for more. And separation had been in the wind for a while. Victoria would not officially separate until July 1851, but from November 1850 onwards it was managed as if it was an independent colony. This is important for our discussion of Black Thursday, because it meant that when the massive fires broke out, it was the Melbourne administration who had the responsibility of managing them, not the Legislative Council in Sydney. Talk about trial by fire. But before we talk about the fires themselves, let's talk about the people of Victoria at this time, where they lived, who they were, and what they understood about fire in general. As mentioned, most of the people in Victoria at this time were British colonists who had either arrived directly in the colony or come up from Van Diemen's Land, that is modern-day Tasmania. Most were free settlers, but there were still some convicts, although there was a strong anti-transportation movement in Victoria at this time. By 1850, recognising that no matter how hard they fought to continue sending convicts to the Australian East Coast, that the population there would no longer stand for it, the British government began bowing to the inevitable. People would still be transported to the East Coast until 1851, but they were exiles, not convicts, and were free to work for wages, start businesses, choose their employer, and did not have the same strictures on them that convicts did. The only special law that applied to them was that they could not return to Britain. I'll talk about transportation in another episode, but there were multiple factors which led to its demise. Had regular transportation still been occurring in Victoria around Black Thursday, the death toll would probably have been significantly higher, as convicts were frequently assigned to work on farms as shepherds, stockmen and labourers. These large properties were on the front line when the fire began to roar through the colony. And who owned these properties? It was men, because it was always men in the mid-19th century, and they were known as squatters. The squatters formed a class which could best be described as the colonial landed gentry, although their power was severely curtailed following new laws around land sales, manhood suffrage, and the makeup of the Victorian government in 1855. They fancied themselves an aristocracy, although in Britain most of them had been low-level businessmen such as clerks, and some had even been farmhands. Because they were among the first people to arrive in Victoria, which they saw as an empty paradise on which they could get rich grazing sheep and cattle, they were able to seize huge tracts of land, sometimes in the hundreds of acres, before the Crown could legislate to stop them. The British government saw the lands of Victoria as Crown land, when in fact it was, and still is, the land of many Indigenous peoples who had been caring for it long before the British colonists drew their borders across it. The squatters often used very violent methods to force Indigenous people off the lands they had claimed for themselves, and because Governor Latrobe would not allow them to use British soldiers for their land clearances, as had frequently occurred in Tasmania, the squatters had to hire private labour, and unfortunately these men were given free rein to do as they pleased with the Indigenous people. The government in Melbourne did not have the skills, the manpower, or the inclination to do anything about it, and there are documents upon documents of horrendous massacres. You can find them at the State Library of Victoria if you would like to learn more. Those Indigenous Australians who survived the massacres often found themselves being forced to work for the same people who had killed their family, friends and loved ones, or they were sent to missions and churches far away from their communities, where the unforgiving colonial administration tried everything within its power to erase their culture. Because the squatters owned most of the land and also controlled the government, they had made it difficult for others to buy even small plots. Most of what was cleared for agriculture or livestock already formed parts of their holdings, and the laws they had written permitted them first dibs on all uncleared land in the colony. For this reason, most of the people who arrived in Victoria before the gold rush settled in Melbourne, which quickly began to swell beyond its capacity. The relatively forward-thinking Latrobe had had streets surveyed and laid out in what is now the Central Business District, but apart from a few prefabricated houses brought over from England, all the structures in Melbourne were either made of canvas or very rough timber. Roads were unpaved. Stone buildings had been commissioned but were non-existent, and there was no water, sewerage, waste disposal systems or public utilities. The Yarra River became Melbourne's universal dumping ground. Everything from household rubbish to the contents of chamber pots, animal carcasses, the runoff from businesses such as tanneries and smithies, waste from ships and every other filthy thing you can imagine was thrown in. It stank all year around, especially in summer, and the people of Melbourne lived packed tightly together in tenements, many as squalid and filthy as those they'd left behind in London and Dublin. And while there was work, many people were wary of leaving the city. It was overcrowded and smelly, but it felt safer than the large properties out in the bush to find it. Living in such conditions, next to a putrid river and packed into wooden canvas homes, the threat of fire was never far from people's minds. You see, the colonists didn't have any concept of a bushfire, but everyone who came to Australia from Europe or North America in the 19th century brought memories, either cultural memories or sometimes their own, of terrible fires. Before building standards existed, fire could start quickly in primarily wooden cities and burn out of control. Most started by accident when candles or gas lights were spilled, or because of poorly designed hearths and chimneys and vents in people's homes. Once a fire took hold, it was almost impossible to stop, and all anyone could do was get out of the way. Firefighting brigades existed, although their equipment consisted of things such as handheld pumps, tomahawks, buckets, hooks, and ladders. They were helpless against a raging fire once it was established. Instead of constantly trying to bring water and desperately throwing buckets on an inferno, the primary method of firefighting at this time was to tear down buildings in the fire's path to try and form a fire break. This was sometimes effective, but other times it simply provided large piles of kindling and helped the fire spread. The other issue that came from the lack of building standards was that there was often only one way in or out of a building at this time, and you can imagine the kind of chaos this caused during any sort of emergency. If a fire blocked stairs in a multi-story building, the only way out was to jump from a window. Not only did this risk serious injury and death in of itself, but windows tended to be small in the 19th century. This was a hang-up from British window tax, although window tax was never enforced in the Australian colonies. And some of them were also purely decorative and could not be opened. People quickly became trapped and died from exposure to fire or smoke. Emergency exits in public buildings did not become mandatory in Australia until, can I get a drum roll please? 1994. This was also the time that the law required fire exits be at least 1 metre wide and emergency doors had to be at least 2 metres tall. No such laws existed in 19th century Melbourne. Doors and corridors were narrow, staircases were small, ceilings were low, and there was not always a back door. Houses were fire traps, and the equipment firefighters have today, which allows them to rescue people trapped in burning buildings, such as fireproof clothing, oxygen tanks, and breathing apparatuses, didn't exist. If people became trapped in a burning building in the 19th century, they were never coming out. The other thing that was unfortunately very common in fires during this period was people re-entering burning buildings in an attempt to retrieve their possessions. Today, one of the first things you learn when you start practicing fire drills is to leave everything behind. Nothing is more valuable than your life after all. Today, we often also have home or contents insurance which protects our possessions. This type of insurance was rare in the 19th century. Most working class people couldn't have afforded it even if it was offered, and they often didn't own much that was valuable in an insurable sense. However, their worldly possessions were stored in their homes, and if a fire broke out, they were likely to attempt to retrieve them, and in doing so, they were also very likely to die. The biggest issue, however, was people going back into burning buildings to retrieve pocketbooks and cash, as this was irreplaceable in the 19th century. Today, contents insurance covers cash up to a certain amount if you regularly keep it in your home, and so much of our transactions are done electronically these days that while a house fire would be traumatic, few of us would lose our money. This was not the case in the 19th century, and if money burned, there was no way to get it back. In Melbourne in the mid-19th century, this was a particular issue as there were very few banks. Most of them actually would later set up in the goldfields areas. It wasn't until 1901 that the banks were forced to open branches in Melbourne. So most people had to keep their cash in their homes. In 1885, for example, a hotel proprietor died in Ballarat after he ran back into his burning hotel to retrieve his pocketbook in which he had £90. He got out with his money but was so badly burned that he died the following day. The money was probably used to pay for his funeral. 11 guests and staff, including the proprietor, died in this fire. And this is a good point to mention another modern life-saving device that did not exist in the 19th century: smoke alarms. If a fire broke out in a building when people were sleeping, they were doomed. The smoke would kill them before they had a chance to escape. Fires in hotels or boarding houses were often especially deadly for this reason. Not only were there large numbers of people inside, few even knew a fire had started before they were dead. A myth that still does the rounds today is that you will wake up if there is smoke or fire, but this is not always the case. When you sleep, you lose your sense of smell, so you won't be alerted to smoke, and the carbon monoxide in the smoke will put you into a much deeper sleep. Most people who die in house fires even today are found in or next to their bed, and most fires start between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m., hours most people are asleep. This was also true back in the 19th century, but deaths were far more common because smoke alarms hadn't been invented yet. So please always check the batteries in your smoke alarm, make sure it's working, and check the CFA and FRV websites for further advice. What's important to understand here is that the colonists in the 19th century understood fire as something that happened in cities and started in homes. They were familiar with it, they were terrified of it, and they did take preventative measures, although these often weren't enough. But what about a bushfire? Bushfires behave differently to house fires. And immigrants from the large cities of Europe and North America didn't have any experience with this kind of raw natural power. They knew it would be catastrophic if a fire broke out in Melbourne, but didn't even know that a fire could erupt in the bush or what kind of devastation it could cause. Now, at this time, prior to the discovery of gold, Victoria's economy was entirely based on agriculture, primarily sheep. The wool industry was the backbone of the colony in 1851, which was why the squatters had been allowed to become such a powerful force in the colonial government. They were the people who brought money into the colony's coffers, so no one wanted to get them offside. During his time as governor of Victoria, Latrobe recognised that the squatters held outsized power and that it was a recipe for trouble, but did nothing about it. As I discussed last season, this was a pattern of Latrobe's. He was very good at recognising problems, and he often came up with solutions for these problems, but he hesitated to implement them, especially if it would ruffle powerful feathers. He was actually quite a timid man in many ways, who preferred to consult rather than act. But in 1851, even in those early few months, things were not going so well for Victoria's agricultural sector. The colony had been enduring erratic weather over the last 3 years, and this had affected the wool industry. If the sheep were not well, then the wool was of poor quality and the colony's economy would suffer. In 1848, Victoria had seen massive rainfall, followed almost immediately by a months-long drought. This was not only bad for farming interests, it was also prime conditions for a bushfire to start. A larger than usual amount of rain causes vegetation to grow at a more rapid rate, followed by a drought which dries it all up and turns it into ideal bushfire fuel. The summer of 1848 to 49 was also an extremely hot one, but the winter of 1849 was so cold that it snowed in Melbourne, something which is incredibly rare. Spring that year was so wet that flash flooding became a major concern, and then 1850 rolled around and drought struck the colony again. I think you get the picture. The past 3 years had seen explosions of plant growth, only to be followed by periods in which the flora was dried out by prolonged dry spells. An interesting quirk also about a lot of Australia's native flora is that much of it is insanely flammable. Because fire was so common on the continent as the trees and plants were evolving, many of them need fire to germinate, and some plants will never flower unless they've been burned. Many native plants have also got very hardy root systems, so that if the flowers or leaves are destroyed by a bushfire, the plant will grow again good as new. This was a good survival strategy for the plants, but the last thing you want if you're trying to avoid a bushfire is large amounts of dry, flammable material. The bush in 1851 was a tinderbox, and all it needed was a spark. But where did that spark come from? No one at the time saw where the Black Thursday bushfires started, and fire investigation was another one of those handy modern things that didn't exist yet. The most popular theory put forward over the years is that it was caused by dry lightning. This is still a common cause of bushfires today and is quite plausible. Fires in the Pyrenees and Plenty ranges to the west and east of Melbourne respectively had been burning out of control for weeks before Black Thursday, and ember attacks from these caused fires to erupt in areas well ahead of the fire front. There were also smaller fires burning around Geelong that we know of, and there would have been others that weren't recorded but were simply lumped into the Black Thursday fire category. Dry lightning, along with the ember attacks, certainly could have started any or all of the Black Thursday fires, but there is another theory worth considering. Gold would not officially be found in Victoria until July 1851, when James Esmond brought the first payable gold to Geelong. However, people had been finding gold in small and large quantities since the first Europeans had arrived in Victoria. The Indigenous people too, of course, had been finding gold for thousands of years before that. Gold was a bit of a double-edged sword for Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries, though. It could be good for the economy, but it also caused massive social disruption, which most colonial governments were not equipped to handle. The various governments of the Port Phillip district prior to 1851 knew there was gold aplenty to be found because numerous people had already found it, but they didn't want to know about it until February 1851, when the first payable gold discovery was announced in New South Wales. So many people left Victoria that the government announced a large reward for the first person who found payable gold in the colony in an attempt to check the flow of people over the northern border. But what does this have to do with Black Thursday? Well, historian Tom Griffiths has suggested that prospectors, hoping to snag the reward for the first payable gold, may have lit fires in an attempt to clear the bush and make it easier to dig. Given the conditions, these fires would have quickly burned out of control, and if the men who lit them did not die in the resulting inferno, they would not have been putting their hands up to admit they'd started it. This theory is just as likely as the dry lightning strike theory, as burning back thick underbrush was one way prospectors cleared ground to try and find gold. If nothing else, the extent of bush burned on Black Thursday meant that areas which had previously been inaccessible were opened up to prospectors, so it probably contributed to the gold discoveries that followed. And just how much of Victoria got burned on Black Thursday? 5 million hectares. A whole quarter of the colony. As of recording this episode in January 2025, it remains the most extensive bushfire in Victoria's colonial history, although there have been deadlier bushfires since then. The extremely dry conditions which allowed the fires to spread on Black Thursday were exacerbated by extreme heat. According to the Argus, it was 43 degrees Celsius in the shade, and there was also a hot northerly wind. These are still the most feared conditions for bushfires today. Today, however, when these conditions rear their flammable heads, firefighters have a chance to prepare for them. Water bombers will be on standby, along with tankers and trucks. All those CFA and FRV personnel who are not already fighting fires will be on call to respond, and evacuation orders will have been issued for at-risk areas. Fighting bushfires on these days is still one of the hardest things a firefighter will do, but their 19th century counterparts had no chance. Once a fire got out of control, all they could do was retreat and pray. Fire brigades in the 19th century had strategies to fight house fires. They were not always effective, as already discussed, but they could fight them. But a bushfire is as different from a house fire as chalk and cheese. You can't pull down buildings to create a fire break. There won't always be water nearby or readily available, and bushfires behave very, very erratically. They jump rivers, they get into treetops and race through canopies, and they send embers flying out ahead of the fire front. They generate so much radiant heat that people and animals can and do fall down dead even before the smoke reaches them, let alone the flames. On Black Thursday, the Argus reported that birds dropped out of the sky as they attempted to fly away from the fire, killed by the radiant heat. Some of the 12 people known to have been killed in the fire undoubtedly died from the radiant heat as well, after leaving it too late to escape. Bushfires can travel up to 25 kilometres an hour and move faster uphill than down, and according to the CFA, for every 10-degree upward slope, a fire will double its speed. Factors such as high winds can also increase the speed of a bushfire, but this was unknown to the people of Victoria in 1851. By the time they saw the smoke and flames, it was too late for many of them to get out of the way. Because the large squatters' properties backed right onto the bush, dozens and Dozens of these farms were completely destroyed. Most of the people who died were people who lived and worked on or near these properties. For the most part, the dead were outdoor workers, such as shepherds and farmhands, who either became lost and disorientated while trying to drive the flocks and herds they were responsible for away from the fire, or who attempted to fight the fire to protect their homes and livelihoods. These workers often had their own cottages on the properties, and many of them had families living with them. However, some of the dead were the squatters themselves. In one very sad case, the wife and children of squatter Richard M'Leland were killed, and M'Leland himself suffered severe burns while trying to rescue them. Alexander Miller, a shepherd who worked for the M'Lelands, was down at the creek when he heard the nearby fires, which had been burning for weeks, change direction and begin heading for the house. He ran up to the house to try and raise the alarm, but was too late. The family had fled, but Mrs. M'Leland and her children went in the wrong direction and got cut off from the creek, where Miller and Richard had taken shelter. They attempted to rescue them, but were forced to retreat back to the water, and they did survive. This was a common story among survivors of the fire. Those who had been unable to escape had taken shelter in a water source, usually a creek or a river, but sometimes a swamp, dam, or even a small lake. These people were often badly burned, and the psychological trauma they would have carried in the aftermath would have been intense, not to mention the damage to their lungs from the smoke, but they did survive. The dead from Black Thursday included Mrs. M'Leland, Bridget, and her children, John, James, Joseph, Mary, Anne, and William. There were also 2 labourers from the Geelong area, James Bowman and Stephen Hopper. Both were killed attempting to fight the fire. And a little girl named Phoebe Horlop was also killed on Black Thursday. The Horlops and the Hoppers lived or worked close to each other, and the sister-in-law of Stephen Hopper and the mother of Phoebe Horlop were looking after the Hopper and Horlop children when the fire came up. Mrs. Horlop had been called away to bring water for the men fighting the fires, and when Mrs. Hopper got the children to safety, she realised Phoebe was not among them. The men went to look for her, and she was unfortunately found deceased. There were 3 other victims of Black Thursday, but I haven't been able to find their names. And I do want to take a moment to discuss the victims of Black Thursday, because it seems incredible to me that 5 million hectares, a quarter of the colony, could burn, but only 12 people died. I mentioned above that the population of Victoria was small at this time, but this needs to be qualified. The European-born and descended population was small, around 69,000 people. But not everyone in Victoria was counted in the census and musters of the 19th century. This figure did not include the Indigenous people, nor did it include the many Chinese shepherds who had been brought over as indentured labour by the squatters when transportation ended. As a side note, indentured labour was technically illegal in British colonies at this time, but it was not a law which was regularly enforced, and it was also very difficult to check. These properties were vast, and the shepherds lived in huts near the sheep, not close to the main house where the property owner or manager was in residence. This was why most reliable sources regarding Black Thursday will say there were 12 known victims of the fire, because there were people who were not counted and whose deaths went unnoticed and unrecorded. Given the state of record keeping in the 19th century, it was also very easy to simply vanish if you wanted to. People arriving in Victoria had to give their name, age, and where they'd boarded, but there were no such things as passports or identity documents. People routinely changed their names, ages, and even the country that they'd been born in when disembarking, and went on to adopt completely new lives. Alternatively, some people gave their real details to an immigration agent upon landing, but changed their names soon after and disappeared into the wind. Having said all this, I'm not suggesting that the death toll from Black Thursday would have been extremely high, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was closer to 15 or 20 than to 12. Deaths from bushfires do tend to be relatively low in comparison with other natural disasters. For example, the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009, which were Victoria's deadliest, claimed 173 lives, but there were 5.4 million people living in the state at that time. More people have died in house fires than have been killed in bushfires, and this low death rate can be attributed to 2 factors. 1, less people live in bushfire-prone regions, and 2, more people leave early. especially since Black Saturday. However, bushfires can claim lives long after the fire itself has gone out. Lung and throat cancers are common among bushfire survivors who breathe in smoke or embers, and bushfire conditions can exacerbate existing respiratory diseases like asthma. Bushfires are also loud. Survivors have likened the noise to a continuous jet engine or a freight train, but unlike those two things, it doesn't pass and instead gets louder, and hearing damage is commonly reported. There are also psychological scars. People who live through a bushfire are at heightened risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and other mental health effects. Those who leave early and do not see or experience the fire directly are not immune from this either. Survivors of Black Saturday who left early have reported ongoing trauma after returning and finding their homes and property completely destroyed. The victims of Black Thursday too would have dealt with all of this, but this was at a time when trauma was much less widely understood and where there were fewer supports available. They were just expected to get up and get on with their lives. Now, I think when understanding something like Black Thursday, the best way to understand it is by hearing from the eyewitnesses. So a word of caution now before we proceed. I'm going to be reading from diaries and newspaper reports of people who witnessed Black Thursday. There's no especially offensive language, but please be mindful that this content is distressing and it may not be appropriate for everyone, so please proceed with caution. But before I read these diaries, I want to tell you about a painting that is currently hanging in the State Library of Victoria. It was painted in 1864 by William Strutt, who had been living in Victoria at the time of the bushfires. By 1864, Strutt and his family had returned to England. He had found the Australian climate disagreeable and was struggling to make ends meet as a professional artist. But he had been encouraged by John Faulkner, who recognised his talent, to paint, draw and sketch important events in the colony. Strutt was living in Melbourne during the fires, so was not directly affected himself, but he, like the rest of the population, would have seen the sky change colour, would have smelled and seen the smoke, and would have heard the stories from the terrified people who fled the bushfire's wake to Melbourne. His painting, Black Thursday, February 6, 1851, is actually one of my favourites in the library's collection. It's not a very nice painting in terms of its subject matter, but it feels alive, like the subjects could come crashing out of the canvas and go stampeding across the polished library floor. If you're local, I'd highly recommend going to check the painting out. I have put a copy of it up on my Instagram, but that doesn't do justice to the work at all. Strutt depicts a scene of absolute chaos, of people and animals, native and domestic, fleeing the fire. The sky above the image is a hellish red-black, full of billowing smoke, with the fire itself only just visible in the background. It is the people and animals who are the main focus of the painting, and every face bears the same expression: sheer terror. On the far left, a herd of brumbies charges away from the flames, with one leaping over the body of a fallen cow who has been gored by one of its fellows, and the remains of a crushed cart are just visible under their bodies as they struggle to rise. Behind them, a herd of longhorn cattle stampedes by, trampling a flock of sheep, while the shepherds and sheepdogs struggle to control them. One shepherd slips and falls beneath the hooves of the flock, while several mounted stockmen crack their whips, either to try and control their animals or exhort their own mounts to go faster and get away from the inferno, or perhaps both. In front of the stockmen is the shattered remains of an old dray and the bones of a long-dead oxen, over which a kangaroo has fallen and is in imminent danger of being trampled. To the right of the stockmen, 2 drays full of panicked passengers have collided, and the bullock drivers are desperately trying to separate them, while the terrified cows foam at the mouth and struggle to break free of their yokes and run. A kookaburra and a rosella have fallen out of the sky in front of the bullocks, dead from smoke or heat, while above the fray dozens of other birds fly desperately away from the flames through the blackened sky. Beside the bullock drays are several people running for their lives. An elderly woman clutches the hand of a little girl, while a young woman beside them raises her hands and turns her eyes to heaven as if praying for deliverance from her terror. Beside them, another mounted man rides past, while on his right, a third dray is attempting to bring passengers to safety. One of the bullocks has just fallen and has brought its neighbour down with it, and two men with bullwhips are desperately trying to exhort the beast to get up and keep going. In front of them is a sundry heap of abandoned possessions, perhaps dumped by others desperately escaping the blaze, around which are the bodies of more native birds, while, in the smoky distance, a mob of kangaroos bounds in the direction of safety. As I said, it's a truly magnificent painting, and I would really encourage you to go and see it. Strutt took a bit of artistic license in depicting multiple dray crashes and shepherds being trampled by their flocks, but the terror and panic in the painting would have been real for anyone escaping the fire, including the animals. It was actually through seeing this painting that I first learned about Black Thursday and was inspired to look more deeply into it. Now, Strutt was certainly not the only colonial artist to sketch or paint Black Thursday, but his work is the most dramatic by far and, in my opinion, the best. There are multiple written accounts too, and I'm going to read a few of them now. And you'll notice that some of the things described in these accounts, which are all from eyewitnesses, are also depicted in Strutt's painting. No doubt he studied them while creating the work. The first account comes from a man named George McCrae, a surveyor who was working in the Mount Macedon region when he encountered the fire. Such heat as I have never experienced in my life before and never wish to again. All the sky appears of one dull leaden hue, excepting near the horizon, where it is red like port wine. The sun seems like a ball of red-hot iron and is sometimes obscured by drifting grey clouds of what seemed to us to be very likely smoke, and smoke it was indeed. We had observed that the eastern flank of Mount Macedon had been burning for some time, and thought that this fire might possibly be nearing us. We could not see, however, as we were encamped in a hollow. I ascended the hill 3 or 4 times, but could see nothing but volumes of smoke wheeling towards us. Small birds were dropping dead from the branches. Crows, eagles, and magpies were the only hardy birds that ventured out. One eagle nearly suffocated, dropped in the air quite a couple of yards before us. My chum and I both went up to the top of the hill and saw the actual fire tearing along towards us. Ran down and informed the surveyor. We 3 and also the men climbed the hill, saw the fire approaching with fearful rapidity. We all did whatever we could to stop it. I now perceived that the country behind the tents was on fire and pointed it out to the surveyor, who immediately set off with my chum and the men to arrest its progress if possible. He left me by myself, armed with a small branch, with orders to flog back the fire should it come to the crossing road. Once it crossed the road, the chances were that it would cross the creek next, leaping from bough to bough, and burn our tents, dray, baggage, stores, bullocks and horse. I stayed for about an hour, flogging with might and main to keep back and extinguish the fire. But as fast as I beat it out in one place, it broke out in another. The smoke was both blinding and suffocating, and here in the heat of the day, the fire almost overcame me. The fight had been a long and fierce one. I lay down for a few minutes for a spell in the smoke and semi-darkness on the hot earth, but the fire passed me close on either hand, almost licking me, and went roaring on. When I got up, I made for the camp. The horse was led down after some difficulty to the bed of the creek, or rather chain of waterholes, and tied up close to the water. The bullocks had to be driven away to a space clear of the fire. We then set to work again with gum boughs to thrash off the fire nearest the baggage. The dray had a most lucky escape. The fire ran right underneath without much more than scorching it. McCrae and the surveying party were very lucky. They were able to fight the fire enough to protect themselves and their possessions, and ultimately they and their animals survived. More than 1 million sheep were killed on Black Thursday, along with thousands of cattle and uncountable native species that became trapped or were unable to outrun the fire. Such was the extent of the blaze that it was visible from the north coast of Tasmania, as James Fenton, a farmer and historian who lived there at the time, recalled. Early in the afternoon, clouds came rolling over the heavens, obscuring the light of the sun in a most ominous and mysterious manner. There was a lurid glare in the sky, mixed with dense columns of blackest cloud banks in the distance, which stole gradually upwards from the horizon until the sun became entirely obscured. The Argus newspaper gave a graphic description of the fate of animals caught in the fire in their edition on 10 February 1851, commenting that pigs and dogs running loose were burned to death, birds were dropping down off the trees in all directions, opossums, kangaroos and all sorts of beasts can be had today ready roasted all over the bush. The newspaper went on to report that more than 100 families in the Plenty Valley area had been made homeless and that half of the heavily timbered areas had been burned. Plenty Valley was a logging as well as a farming community, so this would have been a disaster for the labouring population. In the aftermath of Black Thursday, communities rallied around those who had lost everything, although many of those who could do so returned to Britain or Europe. For those who could not, their only option was to rebuild, although they did so with a newfound respect for the bushfire. While it would be many years before firefighting technology allowed for bushfires to be seriously fought, the colonists who lived through the horrors of Black Thursday took precautions. They cleared the land around their properties to prevent the build-up of dry brush and scrub. They stored water first in barrels and then, as technology improved, in tanks. Dams became a regular feature of the majority of bush properties, and communities formed local firefighting associations, which eventually evolved into the Country Fire Association, the CFA. The CFA remains a fully volunteer force to this day. If you're interested in volunteering, you can find information on their website, and the best way to support your local CFA brigade is through donations, and details of how to do that can be found on the CFA website in the About Us section. And skeptics, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much again for joining me. If you're looking to get in touch, I'm still just as easy to find online. Just search for Juliana Byers on LinkedIn and Instagram. And don't forget to have a look at my website while you're at it. That is www.skepticalhistory.com. That's skeptical with a K. And I'll see you next month for another skeptical take on the mystery that is history. Bye now. The Skeptical Historian is researched, produced and hosted by me, Juliana Byers. You can find a full list of resources used in my research by going to my rss.com podcast page, clicking on the relevant episode, opening the transcript and scrolling down to find the sources. That's rss.com/podcasts/the-skeptical-historian. Sound effects are by Adobe Creative Cloud, Pixabay and Epidemic Sound, used under the appropriate license. The music track The Whistle Funk by Telsonic was also used appropriately. Podcast hosting is by rss.com. See you next time, skeptics.